Hello, this is Tammy with Autistic Wiki, and today I want to talk about self-diagnosis. Is self-diagnosis valid? No, I have to say it's not. This is going to make a lot of people angry because, at least in autistic Twitter, people have argued quite strongly that we need to accept it because if you don't accept self-diagnosis, you're essentially gatekeeping because diagnosis is expensive. It is. It's expensive. And not everybody can afford to pay for the diagnosis or wait for the time that it takes to get the diagnosis sometimes. So I mean, those things are all true and they're correct, and I agree with those, that yes, it is expensive because I had to pay for mine out of pocket, and it was a lot of money. It was a few $1,000s. So those are all valid questions or valid statements, and they're correct. But that in and of itself doesn't mean that we need to accept self-diagnosis as a valid diagnosis, as a real diagnosis, because doctors are expensive for everything. It's not only autism. So if you go to a doctor to be assessed for heart disease, it's expensive. If you're going to be assessed for bladder cancer, it's expensive. No matter what you're going for, it's expensive. So you can't just say that it's okay to diagnose yourself with everything and doctors don't matter anymore because they're too expensive. I mean, we can't do that. That's not real. And we have to live in a real world. Things have to matter, and words such as diagnosis has to mean something. It can't just be I declare. If you have a diagnosis or you claim to have a diagnosis, it has to be a real thing. And we can't just be, we're kind of existing in this make-believe world if we're going to run around and say self-diagnosis is real, because it just isn't. I've tried to accept their way of thinking, but I don't agree with it. I personally don't care if you have like some Facebook group or a website or whatever, and within that space you say self-diagnose, like when you're in this room, self-diagnosis is valid. I don't care if people do that, as long as they understand that when you go back out into the rest of the real world, it's not valid again. You don't get to go out into the world at large and say I am autistic if you haven't actually been assessed autistic. And one of the arguments is, if you're autistic, whether somebody has given you a piece of paper or not. And that's true. I mean, getting that piece of paper doesn't start the autism process. You already had autism before you got that piece of paper. So, so that is true, but still the diagnosis isn't the start of your autism, it's the acknowledgement of it. And it's the acknowledgement from a professional perspective that is neutral, a neutral third party, and doesn't have any skin in the game. Whereas when we're assessing ourselves, we do have some skin in the game, especially if we decide that autism is the thing to have right now, and so therefore we just diagnose ourselves with autism. That's a real thing that does happen. Okay, so if self-diagnosis is real, what does that mean actually? Does that mean that we're now practicing medicine? Because I'm pretty sure you're going to agree it doesn't. If we are practicing medicine, do we now have to pay to go get the license? Because I'm guessing that's pretty expensive. If we're practicing medicine, are we now subject to being sued for malpractice? I mean, can I diagnose myself as autism and then have my neighbor be like, no, you're not autistic, you're just a crackpot, so I'm going to sue you for malpractice? I mean, that's kind of a ridiculous example, but at the same time, is it ridiculous? Because if it's valid for me to self-diagnose, I must be practicing medicine. And if I'm practicing medicine, I can be sued for malpractice, right? I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking. And if I can validly assess myself for autism and declare it a diagnosis, does that mean that I also get to write myself prescriptions and run down to the pharmacy and get medicine for it? And if you say, no, that's ridiculous, well, why is that ridiculous? Why is that any more ridiculous than diagnosing myself for anything? If it's valid to diagnose myself for autism, then it has to be valid to diagnose myself for anything in the world. So at what point are we just declaring doctors null and void? I mean, and if self-diagnosis is valid, does that mean that I can declare myself autistic and then also declare myself too disabled to work, and now I have to collect disability checks and the government has to pay me because self-diagnosis is valid? I mean, that at some point you have to realize that it can't be valid because all of these other scenarios are not valid. So it can't be valid. And some people will be like, no, you're just being unreasonable. Well, am I though? I mean, where is the line between reasonable and unreasonable? It has to be in there somewhere. I mean, if self-diagnosis is reasonable, then it also has to be reasonable that I can declare myself unfit to work, that I can write myself scripts for medicine, that I can do anything that I want to do. All of that has to be reasonable if self-diagnosis is reasonable, because all of those things naturally follow a diagnosis. Before I can go to the pharmacy and get a script for something, my doctor has to first diagnose it, write it down in my chart, and then prescribe a medicine for it. So that's just how the process works. When I went to get assessed, when I went for my assessment, they check for a lot of things. That they check to make sure that I'm not a crazy person just believing in make-believe things. They check to make sure that I wasn't faking it just to try to get attention. They check to make sure that I don't just have autistic-like traits, but I'm playing them up to try to get a diagnosis. They check for all these things, and when you're self-diagnosing, you cannot honestly and fairly assess those items. So if I'm a crazy person, I cannot fairly assess the fact that I'm a crazy person, and nothing I say should be believed. But if we're online on Twitter and saying all self-diagnosis is valid, then it stands to reason that there are at least some people that you're interacting with who have declared themselves autistic, who actually need help, but instead of them getting help, they're being enabled by you, and by doing that you're causing them harm, and that's not right. So you need to keep that in mind as well when you say self-diagnosis is valid, because then the people who are just playing it up for attention are being harmed and you're enabling them, and the people who are mentally unfit and then just believe crazy things are being harmed because they're not getting the help that they need and they're being enabled by you. I think we need to be really careful about having this thing where we say everything is valid and we have to believe everybody and we have to accept everything that everybody says without documentation or without proof. I think that is causing more harm than good. I understand you don't want to be gatekeeping. I understand you want to involve everybody. I understand that the process is expensive and time-consuming and difficult and very, very mentally draining. All of those things are true, but that's not enough to throw that out the window and say that we're not going to go the professional or the prescribed route. We just can't do that. We can't. Not if we want to be taken seriously. Not only that, when I go for my assessment, So I had lots of notes, and I brought up all these things to the doctor of what I thought was relevant to my diagnosis or to my potential diagnosis. And some of the things the doctor was like, okay, yeah, that's interesting, let's talk about that. And other things the doctor was like, yeah, that's completely unrelated. We can talk about that later if you want, but it's not relevant to the diagnosis. And that's another part of having a neutral third party assess you, is that you don't always know which symptoms are relevant or which ones you are putting way too much attention on and which ones you're not putting enough attention on. And part of that is that you're too close to the situation to see it objectively. For example, during the assessment interviews, the doctor would ask me if I make like the high-pitched noises and or grunting and stuff like that. And I said, no, I've never done anything like that. And then maybe like 2-3 weeks later, I was at home just watching TV or something, and my cat sitting next to me on the couch, and out of the corner of my eye I see my cat just give me this look like, what the fuck are you doing? And I was like, what did I do? So I kind of replayed the tape in my mind, kind of like, rewinded to see, what did I just do in that moment? And I realized that I had been making like these weird screeching noises, and my cat was just like, what are you doing? And I was like, holy shit, like, how is it possible that I don't know I'm making screeching noises? And the doctor, so then I went, next time I saw the doctor, I was like, I do make noises. I've noticed it for the first time. And now when I go back through my memory, I remember my cat looks at me like that all the time. So I'm like, I must be making noises all the time and have no idea. But I mean, that's one of the things, is you're too close to it that you block it out and you don't notice. Like in the same way that we don't notice that we're blinking, is you don't notice your nose, even though you can actually see your nose, as our brain just ignores it, because otherwise it would be in your way and it would be like really uncomfortable to have it there all the time. But we don't notice our nose, we don't notice that we're blinking, we just tune out certain things. And you do the same thing with your autism symptoms. Until I went through the assessment and had him asking me questions, and I started to really, really observe myself, I didn't realize that I made noises all the time. I didn't realize that I rock all the time. I didn't realize that I'm constantly stimming. I'm always like either playing with pens or tapping on the desk, or I have this little bead thing that I'm constantly twirling at work. I didn't realize, on one hand I realize I'm doing it because it's in my hand and it's right in my face. But on the other hand, if you would have said, do you like stim at work? I'd be like, no, I don't stim. Because for whatever reason, I block it out. And even though I'm doing it, I'm not aware I'm doing it, if that makes any sense. So it is possible to be too close to the situation to be able to objectively assess it. And this is yet another reason why we go to a neutral third party for assessment, because they can just look at us as is and see these things. Other things is you need somebody to be looking at you to see it, because I can't see it. So like he was asking, do you have a flat effect? Do you have a flat effect in your face and in your voice? And I was like, no, I don't think so. I think I'm extremely expressive in my face and voice, because I can feel my face moving all the time. And my voice, I can hear lots of variation in my voice, so it sounds like I'm just all over the place. And he said, no, you're totally flat effect. I was like, what? I had no idea. Another reason is you might have symptoms that are similar to autism, or you might have some of the symptoms of autism, but not enough, right? Because for the assessment, you have to be able to check off a certain number of boxes to get the diagnosis. So you might have some symptoms that are related to autism, but they actually indicate that there's some other issue going on. You can go on WebMD and spend an hour there and convince yourself of anything. So what I did one time was I had certain symptoms, and I went looking online to see what was wrong with me. so that I could self-diagnose, because I was going through this phase where I just thought doctors don't know what they're doing. I'll just take care of it on my own, because they just look up the symptoms and they're... So I convinced myself that I had prostate cancer. No. So I went to the doctor, sat down in the office, about all my symptoms, very solemnly announced that really cancer. And I asked her how much time I had. And she just stared at me for quite a while. And I thought, wow, she's really impressed. She is so impressed. I'm probably like an honorary doctor at this point. And I was like, wow, she's speechless. It's pretty good. And then she pulled herself together and she said, Tammy, you do not have prostate cancer. I promise you, you don't have prostate cancer. And I got a little angry because, how dare you? You haven't even examined me. How can you tell me for sure that I do not have prostate cancer? This is ridiculous. And with the patience of an absolute saint, she looked at me and she said, Tammy, you're a woman. Women do not have prostates. Somehow, through all of my online sleuthing, I had missed the part where prostate cancer is a disease for men, not for women. Yet another reason why we don't self-diagnose. You can convince yourself of anything if you spend enough time online. So, for this reason and so many more, I cannot get on board with self-diagnosis. I'm sorry, I cannot. I know it upsets people. I see you, I hear you, but I just can't, I can't agree with it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I can't. Whew. All right. Thank you.